Why does every children's Bible skip the 7 years Jesus lived in Africa? Because acknowledging Alexandria would force them to admit that the foundation of Christianity was built on African soil, shaped by African wisdom, and nurtured by African hands. When King Herod's soldiers marched through Bethlehem with blood on their minds, Joseph didn't flee to Rome or Athens. He took his family south, to Africa. Specifically, to Alexandria, Egypt, the intellectual capital of the ancient world, where three cultures converged to create something unprecedented. Matthew 2 verse 13 tells us an angel warned Joseph, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt." But here's what they don't teach you: this wasn't just any refuge. Alexandria in the 1st century CE was home to the greatest library humanity had ever built, where African, Greek, and Hebrew scholars debated the deepest questions of existence daily. Picture this: young Jesus, perhaps 3 to 7 years old, walking the same streets where Cleopatra once ruled, where the Pharos lighthouse guided ships from across the Mediterranean, where African mathematicians calculated the Earth's circumference while Europe was still drawing maps of flat worlds. This was no primitive hideaway, this was the Silicon Valley of the ancient world. But here's where it gets deeper. Alexandria wasn't just Greek learning transplanted to African soil. This was Kemet's ancient wisdom fused with new ideas. The city's famous Marcion attracted scholars who studied everything from astronomy to theology, many of them African intellectuals whose contributions history has systematically erased. The Coptic tradition, carried by Ethiopian and Egyptian Christians, preserves stories Western Christianity forgot. They speak of the young Christ learning from African teachers, absorbing philosophical traditions that stretched back to Imhotep and the pyramid builders. These weren't myths, they were lived experiences in a community where intellectual discourse was daily bread. Consider what this means for Christianity itself. Jesus' formative years weren't spent in isolation. He was immersed in Africa's intellectual golden age, surrounded by the descendants of the people who built the pyramids, who developed complex theological systems, who understood the divine in ways that would later be called Christian revelation. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, older than Rome's version, maintains that Christianity's deepest truths were preserved in Africa while Europe was still converting by sword. Their manuscripts, hidden in mountain monasteries, tell a different story than the one painted on cathedral ceilings. Here's what shakes the foundations. Alexandria's Great Library contained works by African theologians who wrote about divine incarnation, resurrection, and salvation centuries before Christ's birth. The young Jesus didn't just receive Roman or Greek influence, he absorbed African spiritual technologies that had been refined for millennia. Think about the implications. When Jesus later spoke of light overcoming darkness, was he drawing from conversations with African scholars who mapped the stars? When he taught about resurrection, had he learned from teachers whose ancestors mummified bodies in preparation for eternal life? When he spoke of feeding multitudes, did he remember African agricultural wisdom that sustained empires? The silence about Alexandria isn't accidental. Acknowledging Jesus' African education means admitting that Christianity's most profound teachings may have African roots. It means recognizing that the light of the world was quite literally enlightened on African soil by African minds. Even the Holy Family's route tells a story. They didn't just cross a border, they joined the largest African diaspora community of their time. Alexandria housed hundreds of thousands of Jews who had been living in Africa for centuries, creating a unique synthesis of African and Hebrew thought. The Therapeutae, an Egyptian Jewish community near Alexandria, practiced forms of mysticism and communal living that mirror later Christian monasticism. Were these the people who hosted the Holy Family? Did Jesus witness their spiritual practices firsthand? When the family finally returned to Nazareth, they brought Africa with them. Jesus' later teachings about spiritual economics, community care, and divine justice echo principles that were already ancient in African societies. Ubuntu, I am because we are, wasn't foreign to his message. This isn't about diminishing other cultures' contributions to Christianity. This is about completing a story that was deliberately fragmented. African Christianity predates European Christianity by centuries. The Ethiopian treasurer in Acts 8 wasn't a recent convert, he represented an ancient tradition. Today, as Christianity spreads faster in Africa than anywhere else on earth, perhaps it's because the continent recognizes something familiar in the message. Perhaps African Christians instinctively connect with teachings that were shaped, in part, by African wisdom. The next time someone presents Christianity as a Western religion brought to enlighten Africa, remember Alexandria. Remember that Jesus himself was an African refugee, educated on African soil, shaped by African thought. You carry the wisdom of the same continent that nurtured the Christ child, and when you follow PannaLens, you're reclaiming stories that were always yours to tell.